St. Peter's Churchyard in Philadelphia, founded in 1761, which served many of the founding fathers of the United States, leading up to the American Revolutionary War. Among the early statesmen, veterans, and others who helped found and protect the nation during its earliest times, stands the headstone of Commodore Stephen Decatur. During his illustrious heroic career, the highly decorated and well-respected Decatur helped establish the United States Navy as a rising power on the seas. Stephen Decatur was born on January 5, 1779. He was the son of Anne Pine Decatur and Commodore Stephen Decatur Sr. The Commodore had served in the U.S. Navy during the American Revolution. At an early age, young Stephen accompanied his father on a sea voyage to Europe, during which he quickly developed his love for sailing. And through the influence of his father, at the age of 17, he began his naval career on May 10, 1797, as a midshipman aboard the newly christened frigate the USS United States. Following the end of the Revolutionary War, the United States was faced with protecting its own ships and interests. The French, and its newly established French Republic, were at war with Great Britain. They loudly objected to the fact that the Americans were still conducting trade with the British. They demanded the United States repay the debt they owed to France, which was incurred during the American Revolution. France took steps and began intercepting American ships at sea, bound for English ports. U.S. President John Adams had his newly appointed Secretary of the Navy, Benjamin Stoddard, order his senior commanders to subdue, seize and take any armed vessels sailing under the authority of the French Republic. Thus began the undeclared Quasi War. With the American Navy still in its infancy, she was small and mostly untested. Then in July of 1799, the USS United States was ordered to set sail for the West Indies, to search for French ships that were seizing American merchant vessels. After returning to port, Decatur was promoted to the rank of lieutenant. While berthed in Newport, Rhode Island, the USS United States received orders to transport 2 American envoys to Spain. During the voyage, the frigate ran into gale force winds, and at the insistence of the 2 envoys, who did not wish to continue the crossing, the captain changed course and dropped them off at the nearest English port. After her return, the damage she incurred during the storms required her to be repaired and refitted before she could return to sea duty. Decatur did not wish to remain with the ship during the months it would take to make her seaworthy again. He managed to obtain a transfer as a brig officer aboard the USS Norfolk. In May of 1800, the Norfolk set sail for the West Indies on patrol to seek out French men of war and French privateers. During the months-long mission, Norfolk captured or destroyed 25 armed enemy vessels. Then she sailed to Cartagena, Colombia, with orders to escort and protect merchant ships back to the United States. By now the USS United States had been fully refurbished and was equipped with extra guns and sails. Lieutenant Decatur transferred back to the ship later that year. Once the hostilities with the French ended, the U.S. Navy, by 1801, had grown in size to 42 naval vessels, with another war brewing in the Mediterranean Sea. American merchant vessels sailing in the Mediterranean were being attacked and captured by Barbary pirates, who they would enslave and demand huge ransoms from the American government. The newly elected President Thomas Jefferson decided to dispatch naval forces to engage the pirates of the Barbary states, of the North African kingdoms, and put an end to their acts of piracy. An American naval squadron, the USS Essex, the Philadelphia, the USS President, and the USS Enterprise, left in May of 1801 to set sail for the waters of North Africa. And thus began the First Barbary War. Upon arriving at Gibraltar, in the harbor they encountered 2 large warships flying the Tripoli flag. Their captains claimed they knew nothing of the war declaration. Fearing that they would sail into the Atlantic to prey on American vessels, Commodore Dale ordered the Philadelphia to remain in the harbor to keep guard of the enemy warships, as he sailed with the rest of the squadron onto Tripoli. Decatur had been given the command of the USS Enterprise, and on December 23, along with the USS Constitution, they came upon the Tripolitan ship, the Mastico. After a brief encounter, Decatur and his men captured the Mastico. Being a legitimate prize of war, the Mastico was given a new name, the USS Intrepid, and became part of the American Navy. While patrolling outside the harbor of Tripoli, the Philadelphia ran aground. She had struck a reef, and despite several attempts to free her, she became vulnerable as she sat dead in the water. Seizing the opportunity, the enemy captured and imprisoned her crew. A daring plan was devised by Decatur to liberate the Philadelphia. He sailed for Tripoli aboard the Intrepid, accompanied by the USS Siren. He had assembled a force of 80 volunteers, mostly consisting of Marines, intending to take the Philadelphia back from the enemy. Disguised as a merchant ship sailing from Malta, the Intrepid entered the harbor, just after dusk on the evening of February 16, 1804. As she approached, she called out in Arabic that she had lost her anchors in a recent storm, and requested shelter to make repairs. When the two ships were close enough, and once they were tied together, Decatur with 60 men stormed aboard, and after killing some 20 of the enemy, they captured the ship without a single casualty in less than 10 minutes. The Philadelphia was in no condition to set sail. Decatur had been ordered that if she could not be rescued, the Philadelphia was to be destroyed. He ordered the ship to be set ablaze. And once she was engulfed in flames, Decatur was the last man to leave her. By now the Intrepid was coming under heavy fire from the enemy's shore batteries. She made her way for the open sea with small enemy gunboats in pursuit. The Siren moved in to provide cover as they both barely escaped to the open seas. Upon news of his exploits arriving at home, he became a national hero. The newspapers were calling him the terror of the foe. Even Lord Nelson, Admiral of the British fleet, was impressed, calling the mission the most bold and daring act of the age. Decatur had been given the command of a gunship squadron, stationed in the Chesapeake Bay at Norfolk, Virginia in the spring of 1806. Later that summer the Naval Secretary, Robert Smith, ordered him to supervise the construction of 8 additional vessels. After completing this assignment, he was given command of the Naval Yard at Gosport, Virginia. While performing his duties, he received a letter from the British consul, demanding the return of 3 deserters from the HMS Melampus, who had recently enlisted aboard the newly commissioned USS Chesapeake. Decatur refused the demand, citing he had no authority over the recruiting party since they were not under his command, nor had he received any orders from a superior officer to do so. The matter was eventually referred to Commodore Barron, who had discovered the sailors in question were American citizens, who had been impressed into the Royal Navy, and flatly refused to surrender them to the British. Shortly after the Chesapeake set sail, under the command of Commodore Barron, she was bound for the Mediterranean Sea. But the British weren't done with the matter. The HMS Leopard followed the Chesapeake in pursuit. Once the Leopard had closed in on the Chesapeake, her captain demanded the surrender of the 3 sailors. Upon Commodore Barron's refusal, the Leopard opened fire on the Chesapeake. The Chesapeake, having not yet been fitted for battle, was unable to return fire. After the bombardment, 3 of his crew had been killed, along with 18 wounded. Barron surrendered his ship, which the British boarded and took prisoner, the 3 alleged deserters. President Jefferson was outraged over the incident, which was the first of its kind to occur. Commodore Barron was court-martialed over the Chesapeake Leopard affair. Decatur, who had served during the proceeding, was most outspoken about the actions of Barron during the conflict. With France and Great Britain still being at war with each other, causing America's relationships with both countries to deteriorate, the United States felt threatened by the risk of war developing from either side. The Royal Navy, using its sea superiority, closed most of the European ports to American vessels, unless they first traded through British ports. the French began seizing American ships that obeyed British regulation. And the British practice of intercepting American ships to take so-called deserters, many of whom were American citizens, and conscripting them into the Royal Navy, became a major concern to the United States. The events of the Chesapeake Leopard affair outraged the nation, who were demanding President Jefferson take action. Realizing that the American Navy was no match for the much larger British fleet, he rallied Congress to pass the Embargo Act of 1807 as a form of commercial warfare. The act placed an embargo on all ships and vessels under U.S. jurisdiction. The act prohibited imports and exports as well. It also prohibited the import of certain goods from Great Britain. After 6 years of economic sanctions failed to move the British government, President James Madison conferred with Congress. Then on June 18, 1812, the United States declared war on Great Britain. 3 days after the declaration, an American naval squadron of 5 ships, the USS President under the command of Commodore John Rodgers, the United States under the command of Commodore Stephen Decatur, along with the Argus, the Essex, and the Hornet, left New York Bay to patrol the waters of the Upper East Coast. In October of 1812, after Commodore Rodgers' squadron successfully captured the HMS Mandarin, Decatur decided to separate from Rodgers and sailed eastward with his flagship, the United States. At dawn on October 25, her lookout spotted the HMS Macedonian, appearing over the horizon. The engagement that followed was brief. During the battle, the greater range of guns fitted aboard the United States allowed Decatur's crew to get off some 70 broadsides inflicted upon the Macedonian, leaving her a demast floating wreck. After her captain surrendered to Decatur, the Macedonian was towed back to New York to be repaired, refitted, and commissioned into the American Navy as the USS Macedonian. Later in the war, in January of 1815, Decatur received orders to lead a mission of a 4-ship squadron from the port of New York to the East Indies. But the Royal Navy, in anticipation of a breakout of the American fleet, had formed a blockade of the harbor, preventing Decatur's squadron from leaving port. On January 15, Decatur, in command of the USS President, tried to escape alone along the south coast of Long Island. His escape was delayed when the President struck a sandbar, damaging her hull. Once free and underway, 5 British warships followed in pursuit. The HMS Endymion, being the swiftest of the British ships, caught up and engaged the President in a fierce, prolonged battle that lasted several hours. Both ships were severely damaged and suffered heavy casualties. Decatur himself was wounded during the battle. With the other 4 ships approaching, Decatur was forced to reluctantly surrender. He and his remaining crew were taken prisoner and held in a Bermuda prison. Upon his return to America, Congress awarded him the Congressional Gold Medal for his distinguished service during the war. After the conclusion of the War of 1812, America turned its attention back to the Mediterranean. The Barbary pirates had resumed seizing American merchant ships, capturing their crews and demanding ransoms for their release. 2 naval squadrons were dispatched to Algiers. Decatur's squadron of 10 ships, with Consul General William Shaler aboard, were authorized to negotiate for peace with the Dey of Algiers. Upon arrival at Gibraltar, Decatur had learned that an Algerian squadron, under the command of Reis Hamadou, was headed toward Cape Gata. Decatur left Gibraltar in pursuit of the enemy. After encountering and defeating Hamadou's flagship the Mashuda, he also captured the Missouri, along with some 400 prisoners. Upon his squadron's arrival at Algiers, his show of force convinced the Dey of Algiers to sign and agree to the terms of the treaty. Decatur then sailed on to Tunis and Tripoli, and using the same gunboat diplomacy, demanded and achieved the same concessions from both nations. After returning home, once again, the hero, Decatur was now known as the conqueror of the Barbary pirates. Back at home, while living in Washington, D.C., Decatur had been appointed to the Board of Naval Commissioners. In 1820, Commodore James Barron had returned to the United States from Europe after being away for 6 years. His court-martial of 1807 over the Chesapeake Leopard affair had barred him from service for 5 years. He was now seeking his reinstatement into the American Navy. His request met with great criticism among the naval officers, with Decatur being the most outspoken. Barron was especially bitter towards Decatur and challenged him to a duel. Decatur, while still a young lieutenant, had already participated in a duel over an insult he received, and being an excellent shot, decided to wound his opponent in the hip, instead of killing him. He planned to do the same with Barron. They met on the morning of March 22nd. The rules of the duel, as worked out by their seconds, had them both standing just 8 paces facing and taking aim at each other. When Decatur's second shouted out, "One," they both fired. Both men fell to the ground. Barron was hit in the abdomen, with the bullet ricocheting into his thigh. Decatur was wounded in the pelvic area, severing several arteries. Barron ultimately survived, but Decatur was mortally wounded. He was taken back to his home, and later that evening he died. The nation was shocked. His funeral was attended by President Monroe, the Supreme Court, members of Congress, and the Navy, along with some 10,000 citizens of Washington to pay their last respects to their fallen national hero. Commodore Stephen Decatur has truly become a national icon in today's American naval history. He is admired for his significant role in shaping and strengthening the early American Navy by his contemporaries to this day. Across the nation, over 40 towns and cities are named in his honor, along with scores of streets and avenues bearing his name. Commodore Stephen Decatur, the terror of the foe, the conqueror of the Barbary pirates. His name lives on among the greatest naval heroes who are forever remembered and honored by the United States Navy.